Honourable Member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, back in June, when I asked this government why there is still no Indigenous housing strategy, the then Parliamentary Secretary of Indigenous Services replied that Budget 2018 had put aside some monies for Indigenous housing and that the housing gap they experience is unacceptable. It's almost 6 months later, Madam Speaker, a year since the National Housing Strategy was tabled and 3 years since this government is elected, and we still have no distinct Indigenous housing strategy. So really, how unacceptable is it? I'm sure the Parliamentary Secretary will agree with me that the monies announced so far in Budget 2018 are really just a drop in the bucket, and the need for culturally appropriate housing for Indigenous people is a huge ocean. Yet this government has seen fit to delay an Indigenous housing strategy. Yes, they say it's coming, but we must see something concrete, otherwise they are just words. I know they haven't forgot about it. I wonder if it's just not important enough. Madam Speaker, the appalling conditions on reserves are unacceptable. Mold, overcrowding, no safe drinking water. I could go on. And 87% of Indigenous people in Canada live off reserve, and they also face 10 times the risk of housing insecurity and homelessness as non-Indigenous Canadians. This is unacceptable. In my community of Saskatoon West, I've met someone who lives in an unheated garage because there's nothing else he can afford. How is this acceptable in a country as rich as ours? It's unacceptable that a full year after announcing a national housing strategy, this government has yet to announce an Indigenous housing strategy. It's unacceptable and offensive that this government would overlook the pressing and dire housing conditions that Indigenous peoples face. And it's beyond insulting that the best they can do is to create a housing design competition. It's no wonder that it's been called the Hunger Games of on-reserve housing by advocate Arnell Tailfeathers. The issue of housing and poverty is not to be relegated to something as demeaning as a contest in order to win prize money. However well-intentioned it may be, it absolutely misses the mark of dealing with the issues, which is really that housing issues within First Nations communities are at a crisis point. As my colleague, the Honourable Member for Timmins-James Bay, has said, this is a publicity stunt by a government that promised better. They have chronically underfunded housing needs on reserve. So many innovative projects have died on the desks of an indifferent ministry. They are shifting the blame. Year after year, government after government has pledged to do more, but still the conditions on reserve persist. The knowledge is there, the money is there, yet no government has had the political will to act and make a difference. So much for real change. It's more of the same from this government. Other than pretty words, this government has all but ignored Indigenous housing. And they are so much more disappointing than the previous government's blatant disregard. I would ask the Parliamentary Secretary if he could explain why buying a pipeline is more important than fixing the housing crisis in Canada, particularly for Indigenous peoples. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Indigenous Services.
Monsieur la Présidente, Madame la Présidente, excusez.
Madam Speaker, I would like to thank my colleague for her question. And I recognize that we are on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people.
Committed to closing the unacceptable housing gaps for Indigenous peoples. We made a significant investment of $554.3 million early on in Budget 2016 to address urgent housing needs on reserve. As a result of these investments, 14,107 total housing units have been or are being built, renovated, retrofitted, or lot serviced as of June 30th, 2018. Indigenous Services, in partnership with the Assembly of First Nations, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, will continue to work with First Nations to reform co-reserve housing and ensure reliable, sustainable infrastructure for Indigenous peoples. Indigenous leaders have been clear. They do not want a one-size-fits-all approach for improving Indigenous housing. The government agrees. This is why, in addition to the National Housing Strategy funds, through investments made in Budget 2017 and Budget 2018, the government has dedicated funding to support the successful implementation of each of the distinctions-based housing strategies, including $600 million over 3 years to support First Nation housing on reserve as part of a 10-year housing strategy that is being developed with First Nations, $400 million over 10 years to support an Inuit-led housing plan in Nunavik, Nunatsiavut, and the Inuvialuit settlement region. This is in addition to the $240 million over 10 years announced in Budget 2017 to support housing in Nunavut. A draft Inuit-Nunagat housing strategy has been co-developed by Inuit Partners, Crown Indigenous Relations, and Northern Affairs Canada, Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation, and Employment and Social Development Canada. It is expected that the strategy will be finalized over the coming months. In addition, $500 million over 10 years for the delivery and control of affordable and social housing by the Métis Nation, the first of its kind in Canada. On July 19, 2018, the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, Carolyn Bennett, the President of the Métis National Council, Clément Chartier, and the Presidents of the MNC governing members signed the Métis Nation Housing Subaccord. The Métis Nation Housing Subaccord reflects a shared commitment to narrow the core housing gap and further Indigenous self-determination in this important area of social policy. We will continue working with partners to advance Indigenous-led approaches to close the housing gap for Indigenous peoples. I look forward to working with the member opposite on this critical issue, and I thank her for her strong advocacy. Merci. Thank you.
The honourable member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague for his reply. And I am hopeful, perhaps it's not a good thing to be sometimes, but instead of, I'm disappointed, I am hopeful the Parliamentary Secretary, Madam Speaker, did mention that the Indigenous housing strategy should be coming forward. But I think what we often hear from this government is a list of actions and a list of funding, I think in the hopes that somehow people will be dazzled by that and think that it's enough. And it's not enough. And it's not enough to build the housing, the better housing we need on reserves. It's not enough to bring clean drinking water or even a school to the families forced to live in third world conditions. It's a big problem. It needs big, bold action. And I want this government to step up sooner rather than later and not continue to talk about the issue, but actually step up and act. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, we are deeply committed to renewing the nation-to-nation, Inuit Crown and government-to-government relationship with Indigenous peoples. We believe that all Canadians should have access to safe, adequate and affordable housing, and I know that my honourable colleague is a strong advocate in regard to this as well. Indigenous leaders have told us that when it comes to housing in First Nations and Inuit and Métis Nation communities, the best approach is one that respects the distinct needs of each group. We will continue to work with our First Nation, Métis and Inuit partners to develop and implement distinctions-based housing strategies that are tailored to their need. And I may also close that it's never wrong to have hope, and I only offer that advice to my honourable member. Thank you.
The honourable member for Timmins James.